Well, welcome everyone to a new talk of the African School of Regulation, the ASR. Our topic for today is navigating Africa's energy gap, climate protection, clean energy, and investment strategies for sustainable development. On the one hand, this is an obvious topic because Africa has excellent energy resources and needs to use them and to develop the infrastructure that is needed to provide electricity to the more than 600 people that don't have it, and to provide access to clean cooking fuels to more than 900 people that are using dirty stuff for cooking. But on the other hand, the local financial reserves are small, and they are limited, and there are other urgent priorities. And climate change is a very serious concern, particularly in Africa, where the negative impacts of climate change are more acutely felt. My name is Ignacio Pérez Arriaga, and I am the interim director of the African School of Regulation. And for this fourth talk of the ASR Talk series, our guest is Rebekah Shirley, who will be interviewed by my colleague, Daniella Ngarambe, who is a research associate of the ASR. You have the bios of both of them at the ASR website in the registration area for the event. So let me just say that Rebekah, now the Deputy Director for Africa of the World Resources Institute and previously at Power for All, works on a topic that is very close to the objectives of the ASR. Rebekah works in providing access to reliable data and facts to support decision-making in the design of sustainable approaches to development, very close to the objectives of the School of Regulation. Rebekah, thank you very much for joining us today. And Daniella, you have the floor.
Thank you, Prof. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our participants joining us from different cities all over the world. As Professor said, my name is Daniella Ngarambe. I am a research associate at the African School of Regulation, and I'm very excited to be moderating today's talk that will focus on Africa's energy gap, but will also explore the different links with climate protection, clean energy, and investment. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Rebekah Shirley. As Professor mentioned, she's a Deputy Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute. And I say special because Dr. Rebekah was a professor of mine, teaching this very interesting course called Integrated Energy Systems, a course that I really enjoyed just a few years ago. And it's a great pleasure for me to be discussing this topic with her today. Before we start the conversation, I'd like to ask the audience a question. And I'd like to ask my colleague Zita to please share her screen so that we can read out the question, as it's a topic that we'll be discussing in the few minutes to come. So please, Zita, if you're here, please do share your screen. Zita, can you hear us?
Yes.
Hi, Daniella.
Hello.
I'll send the link to everyone. It's on the chat box. So everyone, please answer the question, and I'll share my screen so everyone can answer the
Yes. I believe the question you're reading at the moment is, imagine you're in charge of Africa's energy future, access for all, or combat climate change. Choose one and sum it up in one word. So we'd really like to hear from you. So please do answer the question in the chat box by clicking the link now available in the chat box. And I'll be reading out the answers in a few minutes. Yes, here we go. So imagine you're in charge of Africa's energy future, access for all, or combat climate change. Choose one and sum it up in one word. I'll be reading out the answers in a few minutes as mentioned. Thank you, Zita. Please remember that it's one word and one word only. Thank you, Zita. So we can go ahead with the question, with the conversation now. So to start off, Dr. Rebekah Shirley, we mentioned that you're the Deputy Director for Africa at the WRI. And I would like to invite our participants to read more of your bio on our website. And we can start off the conversation with discussing, by telling us how WRI approaches the energy topic and what they mean by building a clean, affordable, and reliable energy future. What does that mean for WRI?
Sure. First of all, let me just say thank you so much, Daniella, for inviting me to be part of your ASR series of talks. It was a pleasure for me. I had to figure out a way to squeeze this in because Dr. Ignacio is such a role model of mine. And then, you know, the relationship that we built over the course of integrated energy systems was really a pleasure for me, a highlight for me. So I want to start by thanking you. I don't know who all is participating and where in the world that they're joining from, but thank you all for joining us wherever you're joining from and for being part of this conversation. I'm going to start just because I don't know how familiar your audience might be with WRI. Maybe I'll just say a little bit about what we are, and then I'll come to your question about our approach to clean energy access and transition. That's what we call that pillar. But for those of you who might not be familiar with us, as Daniella said, my name is Rebekah, and I'm the Deputy Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute, based here and calling in from Nairobi, Kenya. So the World Resources Institute is an international nonprofit organization that uses data, tools, and platforms in partnership with local partners to help deliver and to help grow and create the infrastructure for growing sustainable economies and communities across the continent. And we have teams that do similarly in Brazil and Colombia, Mexico, Indonesia, India. Our team is really focused on delivering, creating the ecosystem that allows for economies and communities to thrive across the continent. And I stress economies and communities because a lot of our work is first on the economic side about creating the infrastructure and the ecosystems that allow for sustainable economies to thrive. These are economies that are based on nature-based solutions, whether that be forest commodities, sustainable forest commodities, economies based on restoration, economies based on clean mobility and clean energy, which we're going to speak to. So we try to put the infrastructure in place that allows for those economies to thrive, meaning it allows for entrepreneurs to have access to markets, allows for investors to have access to entrepreneurs to invest in, and creates a space for public finance and policy to allow the entirety of the ecosystem to function. But not everything can be delivered, and not all solutions can be delivered through markets. Of course, we all know that. Africa is one of the fastest urbanizing regions on Earth. In fact, the fastest urbanizing region on Earth. About 900 million people are expected to live in cities across Africa by 2050. We're already at about 900 million, so that's a doubling of the population, if it were, and most of that being in urban centers. 2/3 of the urban infrastructure that we will need for those cities is not yet built, doesn't even exist. And so there's an entire body of work that needs to be done on ensuring that our cities in particular are thriving and resilient spaces for African communities and African families to live and earn decent and to live and have decent forms of living, earn decent wages and care for their families. And that's less about investment, but more about working directly with local communities and local authorities, in particular municipal authorities, to think about land use planning and to think about how to attract public sector finance towards investments that need to be made at the city level. So that's about what we do at WRI. We really focused on sustainable economies and sustainable communities, and we take a very data-oriented approach to that, Daniella. So your question was now, what do we do in access? What do we do in terms of answering the question that sits at top of mind for Africa around clean energy? And of course, as we all know, sub-Saharan Africa occupies a very unique, let me say, position in terms of the global energy transition. We have the lowest energy access rates in the world. I'm sure that will not be news now. Even if your audience is not energy focused, I'm sure that's not news to anybody now that we have the lowest rates of electricity access and clean cooking access across the globe. Right now, we're standing at about 43% on average, but those numbers are, take them with a grain of salt. It's really hard to pull together the specific data on these things, and is likely an overestimate. But not only do we sit sort of having the lowest electrification rates across the globe, and there's many reasons historically why that is the case we're not going to get into just right now, but also on the flip side of that coin, Daniella, is the fact that the regions also expected to be the largest markets, the highest demand for energy moving into the future. So the growth in our demand, our appetite for energy is growing very quickly. And so part of that is because of what I was just talking about, the population growth rates and how quickly we're urbanizing, and the need for resources to support these kinds of communities. We're expecting to see growth rates on energy demand for energy that will likely double over the course of the next, by 2040, according to the UN. And so what this means is that there's an increased focus on delivering energy, not just at the household level for access to clean cooking and domestic needs, but access to clean energy for industrialization, for commercialization, for businesses and enterprises and factories. And so this becomes a really complicated question of how do you deliver access, and how do you do it in a way that is affordable, that is reliable, and that is accessible to all. So the approach that we take at WRI Africa, as I mentioned again, is about enterprise, and we do three things. The first is we think about models that address the challenge of affordability. For us, we understand that Africa, not only is it the irony being that it has the lowest levels of electrification, but we have some of the best resources on the entire face of this globe. 19 times what the entire world will be needing as our energy demand in 2050 already sits here on the continent, just in terms of our solar and wind, excluding geothermal, excluding hydropower. So we have more than enough. And I often get this question from people. So you're saying we have more than enough energy resource, but yet we still don't have the access. Can you make those two truths make sense for me? And part of the challenge is around the affordability of these technologies for communities across the continent. We have to remember that we're still dealing with communities where less than $1 a day earned is average. And so what does it mean to create affordable but quality and reliable solutions at that price point? It's not an easy question. And so a lot of our work is first and foremost around creating models, business models for affordable energy services. We try to think about how might it be, by working with farming communities and cooperatives, that you develop business models around mini grids, business models around solar irrigation, business models around solar drying, that allow for the cost of electricity for households to actually come down. The unit economics can come down. So that's one big body of work that we do. We do a lot of work on that in East Africa, in Tanzania, here in Kenya, and in Uganda, particularly with the agricultural community and the healthcare community. So one big body of work is around helping to develop the business models that bring down the unit economic cost at the level of the household or at the level of the farm for access. The second big body of work that we do is around investment and trying to drive more finance, more investment, especially from the private sector, towards clean energy solutions on the continent. The International Energy Agency says that about $28 billion of annual investment is going to be required on the continent to close the energy access gap by 2030. I'm going to say that number again for your audience: $28 billion annually that we have to figure out where that comes from. And again, that's not an easy question. And it won't be delivered through concessional loans and grants that come from aid or that come from bilateral relationships with government. So the private sector has to get involved, both domestically and internationally. So what we do is we create platforms that help to kind of match up potential investors and potential opportunities and communities looking for investment on the ground. So, for example, here I sit in Kenya. There are counties we've devolved energy planning to the county level in Kenya. So there are counties like Makueni County, like Narok County, many other counties across Kenya that have now used our tools, the Energy Access Explorer and others, to create an investment portfolio, if it were, for the county. So Makueni now knows here's exactly how many dairy farms we want to have across the county, and here's therefore how much we need investment in terms of cold storage for our dairy solutions, and here's how much we're going to do on agricultural processing in the county, and therefore here's how much investment we need in terms of value addition activities like drying, like oil pressing, and here's exactly where location-wise we need those investments to go. So we help counties like Makueni use our tools to build those investment cases, those investment portfolios, and then match them up both domestically and internationally with investors, and also think about the technical assistance, the technical capacity building, the skills transfer that needs to happen to go along with those potential investments. And then thirdly, and then I'm going to stop talking, I promise, and pass it back to you. But thirdly, what we do is, even as we're thinking about affordability and as we're thinking about driving finance and investment to clean energy technology providers across the continent, we also need to think really deeply about our energy transitions roadmap. Where are we going? Not just how do we satisfy and satiate an urgent need now, but where are we going in the future? And so we do a lot of work helping countries roadmap their energy transitions pathway. Energy transitions is sort of a misnomer, meaning it's hard to use the language of transition when you're going from having very little to having to. So the word transition is a bit of a misnomer, but that's the language that we're already using in the global discourse. We don't want to add more confusion by changing language. So I just always like to put that caveat in there. But what we do is we help build roadmaps. It takes a lot of research, a lot of analytics. We have very little data on the continent to leverage. And it also means answering some very sticky questions about perhaps the role of natural gas that each country sees fit for itself, the role of liquid petroleum gas as a solution for clean cooking, the opportunity for trading across countries, power from Ethiopia coming to Kenya and power from Kenya going to Uganda. So there's lots of tricky questions that have to be answered in order to think about a country's future roadmap. And so we do a lot of that thinking with countries. In particular, right now, we're working with Kenya and Ethiopia. So as I said, it's really about trying to create the ecosystem and the data that supports a sustainable economy around clean energy and transition in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shirley. Thank you for providing a little bit of context for our audience on WRI's work. You talked about investment. My second question was around investment, but you already talked about it. No worries. It's really interesting to get to know about the investment platform you mentioned and how it's sort of like matchmaking investors and the other party. So I'd like for us to talk about affordability. I really enjoyed reading your interview in the New York Times. I'd like to thank Prof for actually sharing it. He's the one that shared it with me, and you touched on affordability. So could you please elaborate on how to expand energy access while making it affordable? In this case, for the African consumer. Yes. You're muted. No worries.
Yes, sorry about that. Great question, Daniella. So let's dig in a little bit deeper on affordability. So the question that we often get asked, as I mentioned, is this around how you solve that paradox of having this access to technology, having access to resource, but then being challenged on distribution of that resource to a population. And the challenge here is often around, as I mentioned, the economics of delivery. So if you've got a situation where you've got the capital costs of delivering the technology are very high upfront, what it means is that that cost has to be recouped over the length of time that resource is being delivered to a community, or turned into an electricity service that is then delivered to community. And what we see happening is that this economics is oftentimes not taken into consideration. So two things. One is that we on the continent, countries on the continent, let me say, tend to be subject to a higher rates of financing the cost of capital. What do I mean by that? So if you're an energy service provider, Daniella, let's say you want to develop a solar farm, a solar plant in Machakos, just on the outskirts of Nairobi, or you know, in Tigoni or something, and you want to be providing power to a new developing community where you're thinking, aha, I can see lots of people coming in, this place is urbanizing, let me develop just a 1 megawatt or 2 megawatt solar farm. The first thing that you need to do is find resources, financial resources, because getting the solar panels and the balancer system that will be required to build your solar plant are expensive. Over time, let's be clear, renewables are indeed very inexpensive because your operations costs are going, and your maintenance costs are going to be very, very low. But upfront, you need an injection of cash. So what do? You're going to go to a bank, and you're going to say, please lend me whatever I need for building out this solar plant. And the rates of interest that the bank is going to offer you, Daniella, if you were here in Nairobi, are multiples higher than the rates of interest that you would be offered if you were asking to do that same exact project somewhere else in the world. The rates that you're going to be offered here are usually in the double digits. 14%. In countries like Nigeria, we're talking about upwards of 20% interest, meaning that as soon as you build, even if you took that loan, as soon as you begun to build out your plant and offered your first connection to your first customer, you owe money right out the door. Not only do you owe money right out the door, but also because of the global foreign currency challenge and foreign currency exchange challenges, which again, much bigger sort of geopolitical issues that we're not going to get into right now. But because of that, what you're earning your pay in shillings, but you're paying off your loan perhaps in US dollars or pounds. And so as you're earning less than you actually technically are earning because of the currency depreciation. And so 100 shillings used to be equal to $1 last year. During COVID, it was 100 shillings to $1, and now we're over 150. And so you, as the project developer, are even more in the hole than you were when you started. And in fact, there's a compounding effect happening to how you owe money. And then if you think about the consumer side of this challenge, they're also challenged, right? Their purchasing power of that shilling is going down and down and down every day. And so they have to pair the comparison of paying for that electricity to their other household needs, school fees, rent, food, and of course, other daily essentials. And so the available resource that they have to pay for that very, very important resource, the electricity that they need to keep the lights on, becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So when we talk about the affordability challenge, it's both sides of that coin that we're talking about. And that's why I talk about the unit economics. It's not just the dollar per kilowatt hour of delivering the electricity and how do we bring that down. It's also the dollar per kilowatt hour on the user side. how do we make it easier for them to afford as well? So those are the two sides of the coin that we're constantly trying to figure out, how do we make those economics make sense? Part of the solution is, as I mentioned, in thinking about cost of capital and how we make it easier for a developer that wants to build a solar farm, or that wants to do microhydro, or that wants to do even a large-scale geothermal plant. How do we make their access to capital easier, so that those economics make sense? And then secondly, what does it mean for business models to exist that bring down the unit economics on the consumer side? So I mentioned a couple of examples. A big one that we work on is thinking about mini grids and the opportunity for mini grids to have an anchor client. So mini grids being a smaller distribution network to end users. If you had an anchor client, let's say a chicken coop, or a honey processor, or a fruit drying. Let's say you're doing mangoes and you're doing fruit drying. If you have an anchor customer that is able to offtake most of the resource that you're providing, it's gonna improve the economics of then delivering energy to other customers that are on your same grid at the household level, who may be using less. So without getting too technical, that's what we mean, just to dig in a little bit more to the affordability challenge.
Thank you again for providing more context into unit economics and what the work at WRI is. I'd like to ask the audience to please post their question in the Q&A, and we'll try and answer them. But before that, I'd like us to go back to the question we asked the audience a couple of minutes ago, and ask Zita again to share her screen so that we can read out the answers, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Yes, so the question was, imagine you're in charge of Africa's energy future, access for all, or combat climate change. Choose one and sum it up in one word. So we have ethical, we have energy, we have leapfrogging, we have planning. We have, some people summed it up in 2 words. So we have energy infrastructure, energy access, affordability, climate change adaptation, foster open communication. We have equitable. Some people even said both at once. So we have a couple of interesting answers here, but thank you, Zita, for sharing. Let's talk a little bit more about this. So there's a paradox. Prof. Ignacio likes to use the phrase "a big elephant in the living room." So Africa is the lowest contributor to GHG emissions, but facing the most impacts. But again, Africa faces the dilemma of the seemingly conflicting objectives of mitigating climate change, and then again, achieving universal access. Not only those, but economic growth and industrial development as well. So do you believe that these conflicts are real? And if they are, how can they be addressed, and how can beneficial outcomes be achieved?
It's a great question. I like the response of both at the same time. There's many things we're trying to achieve at the same time. The Africa Climate Summit just rounded out, and I think that Prof was mentioning that they actually had an event on the sidelines of the summit. We had many ourselves as WRI Africa. The goal of the Africa Climate Summit, I think we can all, in hindsight, reflect on, was to demonstrate the opportunity that Africa presents as a solutions hub, not just for itself, but actually for the world. The point that was being made at the summit was that based on this wealth of resources, not even just energy resources, but based on the wealth of nature-based resources that we have on this continent. So we've already talked about energy and having multiples of what the entire world needs sitting right here on the continent. But also we have, of the 3 major forest regions across the globe, the Amazon, the Bornean rainforest, and the Congo rainforest. The latest data shows that the Congo rainforest is the last remaining carbon positive lung of the earth. So we're the only forest on earth that is still absorbing more carbon than it's giving off. The Amazon is giving off more carbon to the atmosphere than it's absorbing, as is Borneo, as are many other forest regions. So we have this opportunity of sort of, at any point in time, the Congo Basin, the Congo rainforest alone is holding 3 years worth of global emissions. So 3 years, we're sort of a buffer, a 3-year buffer for the entire world at any point in time is sitting in our Congo Basin. When you think about the critical minerals that we have on this continent, from the cobalt to the lithium, to the mercury, to the copper, to everything that we need for delivering a renewable energy and clean technology revolution sits here. And so the point of the summit, and I think the point that many of the speakers and leaders of the summit were trying to make, is that this means that Africa represents not just an opportunity for itself to evolve in ways that are clean and sustainable, but it represents an opportunity for the rest of the world. And so it was sort of seen as this sort of, and we need to demonstrate the opportunity and grow the investment channels so that we have more investment, and we're turning all of those opportunities and those resources I just talked about into clean energy for the rest of the world, clean industry for the rest of the world, clean commodities being traded everywhere, produced here in Africa. So that's true. That's a truth. But an equal truth is that at the same time, we're also the most vulnerable and have contributed least to the crisis. And what is also true is that the climate reality is not a future reality. It's right here, right now, today. It's already not even just seeping under our doors or knocking at our doors, but it's flooding the entire house down, the entire town down. You don't have to look very far in the news. One Google click on the news to anyone who's from your audience who's not living in Africa will show you ample stories of the devastation already being experienced because of this global crisis. And why I say that is because a lot of what we need to solve for climate change is not going to be delivered through market solutions, and is not going to be delivered through clean commodities. It's about loss and damage, and it's about adaptation and building resilience. And so I think to answer your question of, are these things mutually exclusive? I would say no, but also multiple truths can be true at the same time. The truth that Africa does deserve more access to finance for adaptation and finance for loss and damage is true. And the fact that we have to figure out, how do we deliver access to a population that is the most vulnerable population in the world is true. At the exact same time is true that we can be a clean industrial hub for the world if we have the enabling policy, if we have the enabling conditions, and if we have, of course, the investment. So I see them all as true at the same time, and in fact they are interconnected. The better that we're able to deliver as a clean industrial hub for the world is actually the better that we'll come back to that same question of unit economics and that same question of cost of delivering services on the ground. Those numbers will come down. So to me, the multiple things can be true at the same time. Are we the victims of this crisis? Yes. Are we potentially the solution that the world needs? Also, yes.
Thank you for answering that. I think most of our audience agrees with you. Two truths can be true. So before I touch on, you mentioned the Africa Climate Summit, and I have a question on that. But before I do that, I'd like to read a question from the audience. So Aaron Wilson is asking, what financing methods can you recommend for community energy projects? We are looking into social impact investing and carbon markets for our clean energy project. Do you have any experience or advice when looking to implement these modes of finance? I'll repeat the question for our audience again. So what financing methods can you recommend for community energy projects? They are looking into social impact investing and carbon markets for their clean energy projects. And do you have any experience or advice when looking to implement these modes of finance?
So let's take that by taking one step back and looking at what the financing landscape does look like right now for energy finance in Africa. So right now, across the continent, if you talk about climate finance, how much climate finance actually comes to the continent? It's about at least 9 times less than we need. Right now, it stands at about US $30 billion annually flowing into the continent. That's about 11% of what I mentioned before, the US 277 billion that's needed to implement the NDCs, 28 billion at least per annum to deliver Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is universal energy access, right? So that's just at the highest level, what is coming into the continent. In terms of energy systems is actually the highest overall investment participation. So about $9.4 billion US per annum per year are coming into the continent for clean energy. So that's a good thing, but it's still a fraction of the total 28 billion that, as we talked about, that we need to deliver on the goal. What's more worrisome is that it's paling in comparison to the annual investments in fossil fuels on the continent, which is at 29 billion. So every year, $29 billion of investment is coming into the continent for fossil fuels. And on top of that, local government subsidies for fossil fuels stands at about $37 billion per annum in the region. So that's the financing landscape that we're looking at. And of course, that is not at all to demonize fossil fuel subsidies. If we did not have these subsidies on costs of fuel, getting ourselves around cities like Nairobi and affording access to clean cooking fuels like LPG would be impossible. So I'm not trying to demonize that, but I'm just saying you can see the difference in how much we spend right now, both collectively, domestic and international, on fossil fuels, and how much we're spending on clean energy systems. Energy projects actually have a generally stable risk-return profile, and those that have the most stable risk-return profile are attracting the largest shares of private investment. And so we see about 74% of clean energy investment is coming through private investment because the risk return profiles are actually getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So that's just to demystify one of the myths that we have out there about energy projects in Africa being very high risk. What we see is actually that risk profile becoming more and more stable over time. And we're actually seeing most of the investment in clean energy coming into the continent right now is actually private sector, which is sort of a misnomer. I think there's a misperception out there about where the financing is coming from. And why I say that is because it pertains to the question that you just asked about what are the models that might make sense. And one of the models that I think we really need to explore is more global north, global south partnership, especially in developing countries where public finances are strained, where inflation is high. We talked about that earlier, where debt is mounting due to the pandemic and very volatile geopolitical regions. And then you think about the fact that the bulk of international investments is currently being directed at advanced economies. There's a real need to sort of change the global financial ways of doing business. And what we see is an opportunity for a lot more partnership between global north and global south on energy investment. And so this is actually one of the things that I was mentioning that we do as WR Africa is build platforms for supporting partnership. And what we do is we try to showcase the opportunity for collaboration between renewable energy investors, manufacturing, marketing. We demonstrate the opportunities for investment that exist at the very local level. So we're not saying, we're no longer, the time is, we're far beyond saying Kenya has a $1 billion per annum renewable energy investment opportunity. Where specifically are the projects and where are the partners that you would have to connect with to invest your dollars? So that's the level that we're at now, is thinking about the demonstrable opportunities that exist. And then I think another opportunity for partnership is, even as we're thinking about energy investment, it's not just about the solar farm, for instance, that we were talking about that you might build on the outskirts of Nairobi. It's about investment in the offtake side of clean energy as well. So thinking about, clean manufacturing factories, light industrial and light commercial scale type enterprise. There's a lot of technology transfer that needs to happen, as well as skills transfer that needs to happen if the offtake for the solar and the wind and the geothermal is going to be available. So there's a lot that's happening right now to encourage and promote more global north, global south investments. So there are public-private partnership vehicles and mechanisms and channels that already exist. There are also channels that exist for supporting and promoting more joint venture type approach. And then there are platforms, as I mentioned, for supporting technology and skills transfer sharing. So those are, I think, a big opportunity. We're going to see more and more of that into the future. We're going to see more of this kind of partnership approach towards energy technologies and energy solutions. And then the question, I think there was a follow-up part of the question on something about communities specifically. Could you remind me?
What financing methods can you recommend for community energy projects? That was the first question. Yeah.
Okay, yes. So at the level of the community, I think there is the payment for pay-as-you-go models obviously are there at the level of the household, at the level of the individual. There are quite a number of models that exist for accessing energy services at the individual level. For community energy projects, there's now a number of interesting mechanisms around this. So for instance, our work in Ethiopia, what we do is we use our Energy Access Explorer. It's this platform that helps decision makers take stock of the data that they have on energy resources on the supply side and energy needs on the demand side. And I'll leave it there. Energy Access Explorer, go check it out. It's a really brilliant platform. What we use platforms like that to do, as I mentioned, is partly to help create the investment portfolio or the investment the investment proposal that you would need to attract investment. But what we also use the platforms for are thinking about decisions around directing public finance. So for instance, a government might say, I want to develop a results-based financing scheme around mini grids at the community level. How do I know which communities are well resourced for doing mini grids? Where do those actors exist? And how do I prioritize if I only have a limited budget? How do I make priorities? How do I set my priorities on where to deliver that results-based financing? And so there are schemes like this that are being developed, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya, that help drive financing, both public and private, directly to the level of communities that are building out mini grids and doing more community-oriented energy projects. So I would say that those models are there. I think that there is proven success. There are still challenges, but we're going to see more and more of that over time because the energy service providers that we're talking about, when we say that term, sometimes we're talking about these larger energy service providers. Sometimes we're talking about distributors that have networks, but sometimes we're also talking about individual communities, individual projects that also need to have visibility and access to financing mechanisms.
Thank you, Dr. Rebekah. Thank you, Aaron, for asking that question, and I hope people are checking out the Energy Access Explorer tool. I'll read out one more question from the audience, and then I'll go ahead with the other questions. The question is, shouldn't the focus in Africa be on climate adaptation measures as opposed to mitigation?
Yes, 100% agreed. We are, as I mentioned, less than 5% of emissions. People always throw that number around, and then if you take South Africa out of that equation, we're actually less than 3% of emissions, the rest of the continent. So 100%. At the same time, as we're growing, we have to be thinking about how do we create communities and economies that are going to be fortified, have resistance to a climate changed future. So it's not that we can say, oh, we didn't create this problem, it's not ours to solve, and we're going to go about our way. We actually, regardless of how this problem was created, have to think about in 2040, in 2050, 2060, when we're already starting to see those multiple degrees on average of temperature increase, what is that going to mean for our communities, for our cities, and for our economies? And just to say that Africa is actually the continent that is seeing the fastest. Not only are we least responsible, but we're seeing the fastest response to climate change. We already have multiple countries on the continent that are experiencing and have now documented more than a 1 degree Celsius average increase in temperature. So we're already, this is what I said at the beginning, the age of climate, a climate changed reality is not future, it's present tense language for us on the continent. So what that means is that even as we are making the case that that we didn't cause this problem, we have to be thinking about what does it mean to fortify cities against the fact that water is going to become less and less and less and less available in the future. We're either going to have too much at one time, too little at another time, and we're going to be constantly oscillating between having too much and having too little. What does it mean to create cities that are fortified against that climate, that water future? It means that we have to build water resilient cities. What does it mean to have cities that are fortified against the threat of climate disasters, like storms, like hurricanes, etc. Where I'm from in the Caribbean, we think a lot about that. We've created even less of the problem than Africa, but we have to think about these things. So I think that even as adaptation is the focus, I would not say that mitigation is not a focus. I would say building smart, thinking smart, developing smart, planning smart for the future has to be something that we think about. And that is part and parcel of the adaptation story. It's part and parcel of why we use the language of resilience. And what that actually means is building, what the latest research is showing is that cities and economies that are fortified against climate happen to produce less carbon. So lower carbon intensity is part of the solution for resilience and for adaptation. And so, for instance, what I mean by that, for instance, is cities that have a focus on the urban green infrastructure, meaning think very deeply about urban green space. That is a big part of how you mitigate against climate futures, where you're going to have microclimate shocks, where we're going to see increase in particular city temperatures, and so on. As I mentioned, having green space within cities is part of your solution, is part of your adaptation plan, is part of your resilience plan, and it also means that you're going to be producing less emissions as a city. So it is a mitigation solution. So to answer that question, 1,100% adaptation and resilience building is the focus. If we're thinking about future-proofness, mitigation becomes part of that story anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Rebekah. I'd like to shout out my country, Rwanda, for doing a little bit of a good job on that front as well. Before I read out one more question, if I see that we don't have enough time, but then let me go on to my next question. We touched a little bit about the Africa Climate Summit, but then following recent conversations and declarations from the Africa Climate Summit and the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact in Paris, these high-level meetings both addressed financial needs for developing countries that are struggling with critical debt constraints. And what do you think of the outcome of these meetings? You talked a little bit about the Africa Climate Summit, but then do you think the proposed solutions are enough?
Great question. Thank you for flagging Rwanda, because that's another really great example of that, the linkage between adaptation and mitigation. I just want to give it as an example for your audience. Rwanda, a very, very heavily populated country, right? Very densely populated, let me say. 10 million people living in a very, very small space. And so food systems, how do we build food systems that are going to be resilient to a future where, as I mentioned, you're going to have extremes of weather and extremes of these climate patterns. And one of the ways to build resilient food systems is to think about circularity and trying to waste as little as possible, use as much as possible, and put outputs back, use waste as inputs into the system. Rwanda is doing a really good job at this. It's the home of the Africa Circular Economy Network. It's host to the Africa Circular Economy Network and thinks a lot about this. And as you can imagine, if you're doing circular food systems and you're creating entire economies that think about how to grab waste where it's being lost and inject it back into your food production process, as fertilizers and as compost and so on, that actually is bringing down the emissions of your food system at the same time as your goal was to build resilience, but what you're happening to do is you're mitigating your emissions. So Rwanda is a really good example of that. Okay, so the question that you asked about how had these summits performed, is that sort of the question? What are the outcomes?
What are the outcomes, and do you think they're enough? The proposed solutions are enough?
Yes. Of course, nothing is ever enough. Of course, nothing is ever enough. I think that as the first time historically that political leaders across the continent, heads of state across the continent, came together to discuss and address the issue of climate, which has not to this point been a political priority, I think that is progress. I'm going to say I think that's progress. It's the first time that this has happened, where we were not convened by the UN or anyone else. The African leaders convened themselves to talk about climate. It's the first time that that happened. Regardless of how messy the process was, regardless of how much better things could have been and could have run, I think that we have to acknowledge that this is a starting point, not an end point. In terms of what the summit delivered, was it sufficient? I think we have to think about what came out of it largely was a number of investment commitments and financing announcements, program announcements. So those are very much appreciated. And also what came out of it was in Africa, a Nairobi Nairobi declaration, which is a starting point for what countries are committing to do on climate. So I think that there were important milestones achieved, important firsts achieved, that we will look back on in a few decades' time and say these were crucial moments. In terms of what more we need, there's always going to be more that's needed. One of the conversations that happened at the Africa Climate Summit, and that was continued at the New York Climate Summit, which followed immediately after, and which is going to continue at COP, was the conversation around global financial reform. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, saying that this is one of the things that really needs to change. So we have already put a number of rationales for why global financial reform is important on the table. And the Bridgetown Initiative, which was deliberated here at the Africa Climate Summit, is very clear and contains a number of proposals. And for those of you that haven't read it, you can go and find it online, but it talks about things like, for instance, rechanneling at least $100 billion of finance, public finance, through the IMF and MDBs. It talks about restoring debt sustainability. It talks about debt restructuring. It talks about increasing the sector development lending portfolio. It talks about reforming the trade system, very importantly, to support global green and just transformations. I think this is a conversation that is really, really crucial, because the international financial system is overwhelmingly based on a creditor-centered model, and African countries are thus locked out of bare concessional, meaning low cost borrowing. This is exactly what we talked about when we were talking about the affordability challenge. And the system really right now restricts access to affordable capital. And it's really characterized by very conditional lending practices and facilities. And so to this end, building a financial ecosystem that works for borrower countries is absolutely essential. So for me, we need to have a lot more conversation on global financial reform that is coming. Is it coming fast enough? Is anything ever coming fast enough? No. So that's something that we need to see happen more and more, and continued conversations. And that conversation on global financial reform is directly related to the conversation about increasing access to finance for adaptation, which is a key focus for Africa. So milestones achieved, yes, but so much more that we need to see happen.
Thank you again for that answer. And I know you're looking forward to a lot of things, but then my last question before Professor Ignacio sends us off is, are you going to COP28? And if you're going, is there anything in particular you're looking forward to apart from the global financial conversations around the global financial reform? Are there any other things you're looking forward to at COP28 if you're going?
TBD if I'm going. Let me say our team will be represented. WRI will be represented, and I know that there is a lot of debate around this COP in particular, always around COPs, and this one in particular, about where it's. There's a lot of debates. I think that we continue to need to put pressure on our global leaders for faster and faster change. And if we disengage with the process, then we lose the opportunity to put the pressure on. So yes, WRI Africa will have presence at the COP. The extent of that presence, we're deliberating and trying to figure out right now. Of course, even access to the COP for institutions, even like ours, is limited. And then we have to think about how do we make space and create space, sort of muscle in space for as many local community groups and youth networks as possible. We're always trying to figure out how to create space. So what am I looking forward to there? I think obviously the conversation on financial reforms. But what happened at the Africa Climate Summit was the beginning of the conversation around the global stocktake, which is obviously, as the name implies, taking stock of where we are on NDCs and delivery against those in support of the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord. And as you can imagine, we're not doing very well. And there are a number of readouts on the global stocktake that your audience can just, again, a quick Google search, what's the latest on the global stocktake? So I think there is a real need to push towards action and stronger commitments from countries, stronger commitments now from private sector. I think the focus to this point has been largely on public sector stakeholders for commitments, but the private sector is more and more becoming part of this conversation. So aviation, shipping, some of the major players in these private sector spaces that are responsible for more emissions than entire countries have to be part of the conversation. So I'm looking forward to more action-oriented commitments on the part of countries, but also private sector players. And as I mentioned, really reaching to some, even to continuing and advancing the conversation on global finance. Also, what I've been impressed by and really happy about in previous COPs, a trend that I'm seeing is it being more and more a space of partnership building and collaboration building. So I see a lot of, deal transacting happening at the COPs, which is, I think, important, and then becoming almost a market space for climate partnerships. And then I would say I do see an increasing role from and voice from communities. Last year at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, the African youth contingent could not be seen. They were everywhere. They were loud. They were visible, and the urgency that that voice brings to the conversations can't be understated. So I think I'm also excited at this COP to see even more representation from local communities, indigenous groups, women's-led groups, youth-led groups. Those are the voices ultimately that need to be at the center stage. They're the voices that need to be surrounding all of the negotiations and deliberations, because they're the voices that make those deliberations happen faster and faster and faster. So that to the extent that they cannot be ignored, we have to ensure that those are the voices at the COP. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking forward to.
Thank you, Dr. Rebekah. We're also looking forward to that. We have one more question from the audience, and I'd like you to answer it in 1 minute if you can, because we are out of time. Somebody asked, what are your thoughts on mobilizing financing for energy projects from local sources such as banks, pension funds, instead of relying on FDIs, where the interest rates are significantly high, as you pointed out? A huge premium is being placed on the perceived risk of investing in Africa. 1 minute if you can, and we'll
I only get 1 minute. No, that's such a good question. Okay. So yeah, amazing question. Right now, rest of world, if you look at climate finance, we talked about that picture earlier. Most of the rest of the world is investing domestically in their climate finance solutions. Africa, our domestic investment, both from public sector and private, is only 18% of where all of our investment is. We're the only continent, the only geography on Earth that is still looking outwardly more so than it is looking inwardly. So I completely agree with this question and this prompt about how do we look towards our local domestic institutional investors, our insurance companies and banks and so on, our funds, to think about investment and grow that from 18% to, if you look at the US, you look at Canada, you look at China, those are 90% domestic. We're at 18% domestic. So a lot happening. We have a program around this, but also the Africa Union has its 5% agenda, trying to encourage at least 5% of domestic investment portfolios to be directed to local infrastructure projects, clean energy included. So there is something happening, but I agree with this person that a lot more needs to be happening to target domestic investors in particular. The platforms that we're putting in place to kind of match up investors and enterprises is one way of doing it. But anyone who is on the call that has anything to do with finance or investment, much more is needed in the space of domestic institutional investors engagement on clean energy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rebekah. Thank you. We have really good feedback on the chat. Before we end, I'd like to ask the audience to please fill the feedback form in the chat box. It really helps us make these conversations even better. Thank you very much, Dr. Rebekah Shirley, for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure for us to have you, and I'd like to ask Professor Ignacio to say a final word before we end.
Well, very little I can say. Congratulations, Rebekah, for the great job that you are doing at WRI. Well, I hope that we will continue this collaboration between both institutions. Thank you also for your availability to answer the difficult questions that your former student has been posing to you. And thank you for your insights and your contagious enthusiasm for what you are doing, and we try to do also. And thank you to the audience. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope that we will continue using the resources of the African School of Regulation. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.